Good morning, everyone. So hi, I'm Amy Wyatt from the Wego County Conservation Association. Good morning and welcome to Watershed Wednesdays for your technical shenanigans. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat feature that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of our presentation, if time allows, we will be able to use the raise hand button. And I can open up your microphone so you can ask any questions that you might have to Kris directly. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Lydia.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'd like to welcome you to week number 2 of Watershed Wednesdays. I'm Lydia Brinkley with the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. I am the Riparian Buffer Coordinator there. Watershed Wednesdays are hosted by OCCA and the USC, and kind of are taking the place of our Watershed Forum again for 2021. We will be hosting these sessions every Wednesday through October at 9:30, and you can find the full schedule on our Facebook page or our website. To get things started, today our presenter is Kris West from the Finger Lakes Land Trust. Kris is originally from Wisconsin, and currently lives near Corning, New York now, and has been there for about 20 years. She earned her master's degree in conservation and forestry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she has 25 plus years experience, hard to believe with that glowing face, in conservation, and it includes field work, field research, ecological restoration, planning, community outreach, and land protection implementation. She has worked in land protection with the Finger Lakes Land Trust for more than a decade, and I can confidently say that Kris is my go-to for any land transitions or property acquisition stuff that you are looking for. So I'm looking forward to her great presentation today on how riparian buffers and land protection go hand in hand. Take it away, Kris.
Thank you so much, Lydia. It's great to be here, and I hope we can get through this. I'm going to try to get through the slides pretty quickly and end up on a slide that just focuses on conservation easements, because I know that's an issue that a lot of people don't understand as deeply as some of the other standard restoration techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just get right into the slides. And I'm going to see if I can, oh, I guess I'm not. Anyway, so I like to start here with a quote from Mark Twain, because the partnerships that we're talking about today are just another element, another view or facet of partnerships that we're all used to working with. You know, the Land Trust works with multiple partners. I know USC does as well. So the projects I'm going to be presenting to you today really are just kind of a slightly different twist on some of the work that we've been doing for quite some time. To introduce the partners, there's the Upper Susquehanna Coalition, and the focus here I wanted to make is the distinction between USC and the Land Trust, where USC is a government agency that is primarily funded through public dollars, and their strength really is bringing technical expertise on a watershed basis to protect and improve water quality. So they are the boots on the ground across the watershed, and they are able to share resources among 22 different soil and water conservation districts in the Upper Susquehanna watershed to really maximize their impact on the ground. So the Finger Lakes Land Trust, on the other hand, is an independent, private, not-for-profit conservation organization. And our focus is working in 12 counties of upstate New York that you can see here in this map. And we're primarily funded through private funding, whether it's donations, grants, or through foundations. And our primary tools for land conservation are either fee acquisition or conservation easements. And we try to focus our efforts in some very specific focus areas within our overall service area. So today I'm going to be talking about 3 different projects that we've been partnering with USC on over the last couple of years. And I want to give a shout out to both Lydia and Wendy Walsh, the Watershed coordinator, who have really been instrumental in helping us really advance and kind of elevate the level of conservation that we've been able to do on each of these projects. So I'm going to talk about 3 different projects that have involved multiple elements. So first I'm going to jump into the Shiman River, which is a site right here between the city of Elmira and Corning. And then we're going to jump up into the headwaters of the Wego Creek watershed. And Wego Creek is a really important eastern brook trout stream. So jumping into the Shiman River, this is a site where the land trust is actually a landowner. We own a roughly 42-acre nature preserve on the Shiman. We acquired it several years ago, and there's a 5-acre field up near the river that has just been overtaken with a rogues gallery of invasive species. And while we can hold and manage land, we don't really have the resources to undertake intensive restoration of a site like this. And so that's where USC was able to bring in their capabilities and their funding to see if we could bring this just mess of, I guess it was dominated by honeysuckle and autumn olive and tree of heaven, which is actually of particular concern because it's a preferred host plant for spotted lanternfly, which is starting to spread throughout Pennsylvania, just downstream of us. So USC brought in their team to clear the field. They've actually brush hogged it now 3 times. And they brought in some subcontractors to plant about 1,200 trees in this 5-acre restoration site. And then the land trust will now kind of move forward with monitoring those trees, making sure that the weeds are managed and doing some of the very important post-planting management. Again, we'll still be relying on USC to bring in their bigger equipment if we need it. Now jumping over into the Wego Creek watershed, here's a site where, again, the land trust is the landowner, but we partnered with USC very early in this process where we had an existing preserve, and then this property that was next to it came up for sale. And so we were looking for both funding and assistance to restore this property. So USC came in with some partial funding to help us acquire the land. And then Lydia and her team came in and developed this buffer restoration plan. This property was part of a dairy farm. And until we acquired it, there were actually dairy cattle grazing throughout this southern part of the property. And they had full access to the creek. And so first step was we acquired it, the cattle were taken out of the property, and Lydia and her team came in and did an 11-acre restoration along the creek and put in about 2,400 plants. So that's where the USC really kind of elevated their relationship with us with adding some land acquisition funding to the restoration portion of the project. Now there's the third project is just upstream from the Gutchess Wetlands project that we just talked about. And this is a project where the land trust holds a conservation easement. And so what we did on this project with USC is we really just played matchmaker. So I want to tell you the story about this property because it's really kind of neat. So John and Sue are the landowners. They owned this and they live on this property west of Canaan Road. And their property was tucked right up into and next to the Hammond Hill State Forest. And after they had lived there for many, many years, this property on the other side of the road came up for sale. And so they decided to put together the funding to purchase this property specifically to protect it. And so this is a really typical kind of landowner that the land trust works with, and it might be a little different from the kind of landowners that the USC typically works with. It's a non-farming family. They are very, very strongly invested in just protecting their land. So they purchased the property, and then they reached out to us saying that they would like to permanently protect it with a conservation easement. At the same time, shortly after they purchased the property, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was doing some trout surveys, and they documented that the eastern brook trout population actually was up in this reach of the stream. And there was a culvert that was kind of perched on their property. It was an old culvert that used to go under an old farm road, but the farm road had fallen into disuse and hasn't really been used for many, many years. The land trust kind of gathered all of the partners together and said, okay, let's talk about, how is this project going to move forward? And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stepped in first, and they were able to remove this culvert and do some in-stream work to restore the stream bed. And that was in 2019, I believe. And then last year, USC stepped in and they established a riparian buffer restoration on about just under 4 acres on either side of the creek. And throughout this couple-year process, the land trust has been in the background negotiating a conservation easement with the landowner. And so the conservation easement, when we close, and actually we're scheduled to close in a couple of weeks, will first of all retain this entire property as one parcel. It can never be divided and sold off into different pieces. And the conservation easement will allow John and Sue very, very broad latitude to use the land around their house. They've got a driveway and a garage and workshop. They've got a couple of ponds. So there's going to be very broad latitude afforded them to do pretty much what they want over in this area, as long as the property is used primarily for residential use. There are limits on the number and type of structures that can go into this area, but the idea is concentrate any structures and buildings in this zone. Then they also wanted to maintain their ability to mow this roughly 10-acre field on the east side of the road. And they typically want to just mow it for wildlife habitat, but they also saw some value in allowing a landowner in the future to be able to potentially, raise livestock or have a small farm operation, a small CSA or something like that. So the conservation easement does allow for agricultural use of this area here. And then we have a forest management zone. So the intention here is to make sure that the forest on this part of the property, which actually occupies some pretty steep slopes with very highly erodible soils, the idea here is to allow for that forest to be used for recreation, hiking, some light timber management. And then along the creek, our conservation easement prohibits any kind of structures and allows for that restoration and maintenance. But the idea here is to not have any kind of intensive use or management of the buffer areas along both segments of both the main stem, which is in this 10-acre zone, and there's a small tributary that comes in over here that's also protected in that stream buffer zone. So that's how the conservation easement will permanently protect the plantings that Lydia has installed, and the stream restoration that Jan Dedici through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service undertook a couple of years ago. So really what we're doing here is each organization is able to bring their strengths and to the project, and we're really able to kind of layer on different elements of what we can each bring to the table to provide permanent protection and restoration to some really important stream areas. So I wanted to kind of whip through the slides pretty quickly to see if any people had questions or if we wanted to have a discussion about how to replicate this concept elsewhere.
Thanks, Kris. Does anybody have any questions? We can see if anyone raises their hand or we can unmute you. Kris, how did you acquire the Kehoe Nature Preserve?
So Kehoe was a donation. So that was a donation of land from a family who originally it was a father-son pair who acquired the property, and they had big plans for the property about 30 years ago. And you can see just south of the preserve boundary, there's a road with a small neighborhood. They actually developed that neighborhood, and they had planned for about 30 houses to go on the rest of this property. But there were, life happened. There were changes in the market, changes with within the family, and those plans were never realized. And one of the other family members was really very interested in conserving the land. And it was through her dedication to land conservation that we were able to, negotiate a gift of land from that family.
I'll just add too that with this project and the attention that it drew, we were able to engage with the landowners to continue the buffer down outside of the Kehoe's boundaries. And that type of interaction is also happening at the Sue and John's property there, where their neighbor also owns a significant portion of a Wego Creek frontage down south. And so we're engaging with that landowner to make sure we have riparian buffer establishment and then permanent protection through the Finger Lakes Land Trust as well.
Yep. Yep. We hope to, in a few years, start really having a conversation with those landowners as well. They're not quite ready to move forward with the easement, but they're committed, and they just have to get a few ducks in the row before they can move forward on that.
Great presentation. I was just wondering, you mentioned that the land trust then takes on the responsibility of the maintenance of some of the buffers at least. Is that a typical sort of activity for you guys, or do you have to line up funding, special funding, maybe outside of your normal budget to do that sort of work? Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for the question, Scott. I appreciate it. So with the maintenance, we do have 2 land stewards who are dedicated to preserve management, but we own about 35 nature preserves on about 5,000 acres of land that's scattered across the region. So for the maintenance, they will be working to employ volunteer teams. And we will be seeking additional funding if we can put together some funding to help with the maintenance, but a lot of that will be undertaken with volunteer help. And the land trust has the maintenance responsibility on the properties that we own. So the property with the conservation easement, this last one that I spoke about, that management is going to be the responsibility of the landowner. So the role that the land trust takes in properties where we hold conservation easements is making sure that the use of the property is in accordance with the limitations set forward in the conservation easement. So we will be, for instance, defending if somebody decided they wanted to put up a barn over on the east side of Canaan Road, for instance. We would have legal standing to go in and say, sorry, but you need to move your barn out of there because that's not allowed. Or if somebody wanted to plant corn right up next to the creek, we could say, sorry, that's not allowed. You need to restore that to back to where it was. So the level of land trust involvement really depends on whether we own the land or if we're a conservation easement holder.
We still have a few minutes if anyone else has any other questions.
Okay, the question is, that's not a question, more of a statement with respect to easements. And that is, in particular, with respect to riparian easements, is that the responsibility of annual checking on the conditions to make sure that the conditions are met is the big thing that most government agencies don't want to deal with, because they do not want the continued responsibility of annual checkup to make sure that things are going along the way they are, because that's a big responsibility. And that's why the land trust, such as Finger Lakes Land Trust, has, special accounts that they have reserves just for monitoring. But that's a big expense. And you've got to have endowments for that, which is what the trust has, I'm sure.
Yep. And I should also add, so, and that's a great point. With our stewardship of our conservation easements, we take our role really very seriously, because every new easement that we take on, we're taking on a perpetual obligation to keep an eye on that property, again, forever, perpetually. So each easement requires that we not only help talk with the landowner about how to cover costs for, say, survey and the standard real estate transaction costs like abstracting and recording fees, but we also raise a stewardship endowment fund for each project. The funding for this particular project actually came from the New York State DEC's riparian buffer grant program for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we were able to use public funding to help support the costs of this conservation easement, including that stewardship fund contribution. The stewardship fund contribution is a one-time kind of expense that we look to meet for each project. And what we do with that money is we set it aside in an endowment that is used both to support our stewardship staff to make sure we've got, folks available to keep an eye on these properties, but also it sets up a legal defense fund so that if or when there's a violation of the easement, we have the resources to respond and defend the easement.
Fantastic. Kris, there has been a couple more questions in both the Q&A and the chat. We'll start over here for question and answer. Are landowners paid for putting their land into easement?
So yes, they can be. So there are different sources of funding for conservation easements. In New York State, there's the Farmland Protection Program, which is focused on protecting farmland with high quality soils that are under very serious threat of conversion to non-farm use. And that's a very competitive grant program. We've been able to engage with farmers, typically in the northern part of our service area where the soils are a little bit better than in the southern, the Susquehanna watershed portion of our service area. There are other sources of funding that are coming online. Recently, a few years ago, New York State decided to expand funding that's available for water quality improvement projects, which typically was used for, say, improvements to water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, that kind of thing. They actually have set aside some funding through that grant program to be able to fund acquisition of lands that are important for protecting drinking water supplies. So we've been able to deploy those public funds in the 6 Mile Creek watershed, which is the drinking water supply for the city of Ithaca, and in the Skinny Atlas Lake watershed, which is the drinking water supply for Syracuse. We're looking forward to next year another grant opportunity that will be administered through the Land Trust Alliance to protect forest lands. And I'm hoping that that program we might be able to deploy more broadly in the Susquehanna watershed because it is, our part of the watershed is more forested than farmland. So those are the sources of funding. They are all from public funding sources that we're able to apply for grants. In the meantime, we still, we don't have funding ourselves to purchase conservation easements. So in the case of the Compton and Sailor easement that I discussed earlier, that was a donated conservation easement, and those landowners were not compensated for the value of their easement or the termination of their development rights.
All right, we have a couple more, Kris. These next, I think, are two quick ones, and then we've got a few others. How many properties does the land trust hold that were acquired as gift, kind of approximately? And with the land trust, are you restricted to acquiring properties in a limited number of counties?
So the second question is easy. We are incorporated to serve a geographic area, which was on that first map. The 12 county, this is our service area. So this is the area where we work, but there are land trusts across the country. So if you go to the Land Trust Alliance website, there's a link called Find a Land Trust, and you can zoom into different states and they will give you a list of the different land trusts operating in that area. I believe that in New York State now, the entire Susquehanna watershed is served by a land trust of one form or another. So in the first question, I didn't quite understand how many properties do we own and manage?
No, they wondered how many of them were given as gifts.
Oh, I don't know. I would, yeah, I don't know. So all of the conservation easements we received before the FPIG program started, probably about 10 years ago, those were all donated. But I'm sorry, I honestly don't know how many were donated.
No worries. We have a couple more questions. For the buffer portion of the easement, what sort of language do we include regarding what to do in the aftermath of a flood event? Is the land trust or the landowner obligated to return the stream and the buffer to its original condition?
So there's no obligation to, if the landowner didn't take action to cause that problem, then there's no obligation on the landowner to fix it. So I think what we do is, what we're doing is we're limiting the landowner's activities. And so, we don't try to limit what Mother Nature does, especially with the increasing intensive storms we're getting. I don't know if does that answer that question?
I think so. Scott will let us know if not. Also, everyone, yes, he says yes, thank you. Also in the chat, there's some information that some of the attendees have put in there, including the findalandtrust.org. So people want to take a look, they can. And we are actually at time. So before you all go, just showing off for next week, we have, I'm going to take the screen, Kris, if that's okay. Yeah. Next week, feel free to join us at 9:30, on the 18th. We have our underwater drones for learning to teach for environmental and conservation. Sorry, apparently I cannot read this morning. I apologize. But this will be very exciting. So we hope to see you next week. Kris, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us and with some great questions. We are excited for having you with us today. So
thanks very much, guys.